Hi, so we're going to make another start, and just to quickly introduce Hana Fluck, who is the head of environmental research at Historic England, and she'll be talking about the nature-culture divide, why it matters for policy and practice. And I'm passing over presenter privilege to you.
My day got off to a great start when a squirrel managed to cause a power cut in my village. So I feel like nature and culture are not perhaps in harmony at the moment in my world. Okay, I think I've got control, Hannah. Thank you. Yes, so I wanted to look a little bit at what the experiences, particularly from a very England-centric approach, I'm afraid, of trying to work in policy that butts up against both the natural environment and cultural environment, and what that looks like from a policy and practice perspective. But I'm very aware that actually even the distinction between nature and culture is itself not one that is universally defined or recognized, and in fact you could probably argue that it's a minority view to separate the two, certainly in terms of the grand scale of human history and at a global perspective. But it is important because it is something that exists within the language that's used, not just nationally but also internationally, and certainly so. In the UK, we have separate departments for culture, DCMS, the department that oversees my organisation, Historic England, and DEFRA, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, oversee matters of the environment. And internationally, organisations that oversee climate change, so the IPCC, for instance, the focus of their work and the conversations around climate change have very much focused on environmental science and environmental perspectives, and have only, I mean, Hannah knows this better than anyone having looked into it, but only reference culture, often in a negative way, as something that might be a barrier to change. But there's very little integration of approaches that take into account the common ground between culture and natural environmental perspectives. I think you do start to see a merging of the two when you look at landscapes, and I think landscapes are particularly important.
Do tell me when to use the slides.
Yeah, it's okay. I think I have control now, Hannah, actually. So I think.
One second, let me move it back.
I think the screen has stopped confusing me. So hopefully, thank you. Yeah. So when you look at landscapes, we do start to see policy that recognises both the cultural and the environmental elements of that, and I think that's particularly well articulated in the European Landscape Convention. But sadly, when it comes to the delivery of a lot of practical policy, the division between those government departments and between the designation of places and how that plays out in practice often doesn't allow for the integration of those things. And I think Caitlin earlier mentioned the Landscape Futures project that she and myself and Rodney are involved in. And one of the things that we're looking at in that project is how those strands of culture and nature can come together, and how landscape might be a constructive lens for that. So why does it matter? There are a number of reasons why it matters, and one of the observations that I've made, so I should hold my hand up, I'm an archaeologist and an archaeologist that specialises in human evolution originally, so I tend to think very big scale about the relationship between people and the world, and I think it's fair to say that I probably take a pretty long view on the Anthropocene, but it matters because our environment and our world around us is not natural. People have been shaping our environment for thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. And I think people very easily forget that. And understanding the physical nature of our culture, the physical manifestations of culture in our environment is a really important thing. It's not just about the interpretation or something that happens on top of a blank canvas. Our very physical environment and the natural world around us exists because of its relationship with us and because of our activities. So I've got a slide here that comes from a recent publication in our research news, which is available online, from a Leverhulme-funded project which involves the University of Plymouth and also Historic England, looking at the history of biodiversity and human activity. And one of the really fascinating things, something that really struck me, was an observation that there is a shift in biodiversity, an increase in biodiversity with increasing mosaic landscapes that you get with the introduction of farming. So we have been shaping our landscape and our biodiversity for at least 6,000 years in ways that can be picked up in the archaeological record. And there are other examples here. So on the left of that slide, there's a picture of the Somerset Levels, a landscape which today most people would know as being one of a green and pleasant area of fields, dry land. But the picture at the bottom shows it under flood in 2014, I believe. And the site there is actually the Saxon Burr and monastic complex at East Ling and the Isle of Athelney, which is one of those areas where King Alfred was meant to have hung out when he was hiding from the Danes in the reed beds and the marshlands of Somerset. I think it's also ways to burn the Cape. But it's not just the UK, it's also places that we think of being more wilderness-like. So rainforests, we're hearing more and more evidence for how places like the Amazon rainforest are actually the product of human activity, again, over thousands of years. So it matters that we understand that and we understand the time depth of our relationship with nature. It also matters because the challenges that we're facing today, particularly around climate change and the climate and biodiversity crisis, they are anthropogenic problems. And the Climate Heritage Network, which I think you may hear a bit more about later, if you haven't already, we have a phrase that to solve an anthropogenic problem needs human solutions. And I think it's really critical that understanding our long-term role in the way in which our environment is today also makes us appreciate that we need human solutions. It's not about backing off and letting nature take over. We have to be instrumental in working to create those solutions that are best for the environment which we have made. And a nice example there of the ways in which the evidence is growing for maintaining historic disturbance regimes and often traditional land use practices really can make quite a difference to the future resilience of biodiversity to some of these problems that are going to arise because of anthropogenic climate change. It also matters because of communication. So people are pretty darn selfish. We are very self-centered. The reasons we care about climate change are because it affects us, because it affects our ability to survive. And if you really start picking away at it, I suspect the reason that a lot of the biodiversity concerns that we have are also there's things that we care about, that we like, they're things that we're interested in. And we are a pretty self-centered species. But that affects how you communicate. So I find it fascinating. I've been gradually trying to collect some of these examples where when people are trying to talk about the environment or nature, they very often illustrate it with examples of cultural heritage or culturally, very obviously humanly created and cultural landscapes, or with people. And I think that that's important because they recognise, as Natural England do, that actually you've got to engage people, and people are at the heart of the solutions to these problems as well as part of the problem. And I think the organisation Climate Outreach, previously known as COIN, have done a number of really excellent publications that look at the importance of thinking about communication and the ways in which we use imagery and words and structure that communication to make a really huge difference. There's a lot of discussion about taking things back to nature, about rewilding or wilding, about working with nature. It goes back to that idea that I think I've floated a little earlier on, that actually withdrawing we're the cause of the problem, so the part of the answer is to withdraw our impacts in order to improve the outcomes. But I think, as was mentioned earlier, the work of the National Flood Forum, people are at the heart of it. It's people that will be suffering, and I think even the most enthusiastic natural environment person would struggle to suggest that we shouldn't try and engage people in that. So taking us back to nature requires us to understand that actually most of those instances and most of the work that we do needs people. So some examples are historic grazing marsh, which is a humanly constructed landscape. Flood risk zones involves understanding water courses. Right, Hannah, was that ding telling me I'm out of time?
1 minute to wind up.
1 minute, brilliant. Okay. And some other examples here of where people or historic places and cultural heritage are absolutely critical to the survival of biodiversity, and things that we need to work together to try and bring these aspects out more strongly in our practice. Oh no, could you move the next slide, please, Hannah? I've got yeah, there was an interesting concept of whether natural processes are more destructive for cultural heritage and constructive for the natural environment. But I think, again, this isn't always true. The management of natural processes is important for both those aspects. And just quickly, the ways in which we can work with both these elements together to help with climate change is particularly important around things like carbon sequestration, understanding the nature of our existing historic places and green places and how we can manage those better and how those have been managed, as well as the very history of our places and why they get wet, why they are dry. And just finally, I thought this was rather fun. I was at Greenham Common the other day, an important area for wildlife. But then you start thinking about the other aspects of the heritage of these places and how we can bring that into the mix, and the importance of bringing that into the mix. So I think most people think of Greenham Common and the peace protests and CNB marches in its time as a nuclear base. But more recently, it was used for filming Star Wars. And I think there's an awful lot of people who would first and foremost recognize some of the imagery from the most recent Star Wars film. And I think bringing those things to bear on how we can engage people with those places and the future of those places is really important as well. So, sorry, just finally. So I think the distinction between nature and culture, it is cultural and it varies depending on who you're talking to, but it has become embedded in our environmental and cultural policies and practice, and we need to be really mindful of that. And in that, it is a barrier to our ability to respond appropriately to the climate and biodiversity crisis, because if we don't recognise those close connections, we will have problems. We need more integrated ways of working, and neither is currently able to address this fully. But if we recognise those connections and interdependencies, then we can help progress people-centred solutions that are sustainable for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And also another thing is maybe if you can stay on for the next panel, you can be a part of that discussion as well. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask touched upon one of the last points that you made about integration. Working with Historic England, you're obviously not only have an advisory role for government, but also are an independent research organization and work with various research projects. So you sort of embody exactly what we aim to accomplish, which is drawing in on different sectors and working together. And I was wondering, in your experience, looking at the nature-culture divide, looking at the challenges of trying to bring the climate agenda to the fore, what are some takeaway tips or challenges that you've had to overcome in doing that?
That's an interesting question. I think the biggest challenge for me is the leap that people make to, forgetting about the material aspects of culture and that connection with materiality and places, and I think that's the strongest connection between those concepts, and I think people forget that or take it for granted. So I think particularly archaeologists and landscape specialists are often cautious or not necessarily realise how much other people don't understand the connections and the time depth of places, and how important it is that we convey that. I think that's probably one of the key challenges. I think we also focus on trying to understand some of the language and trying to translate some of the terms, or just recognising that there are terms that we use that are not necessarily understood in a common way, or indeed may have very different meanings. And I think conservation is a very interesting one, which is used differently in the natural environment and historic environment, or can be. Heritage is another, actually, that I think we often use without defining.
And we have a question about, I suppose you could say, about nature and culture in terms of like invasive species, and how you see that in understanding, managing, let's say, of the different natural and cultural heritage, or if you have a view on that.
That's a really interesting question. I am not an ecologist, and I know that there are a lot of discussions amongst ecologists about how those are managed. So I think there are also some differences, which I must confess I probably don't have the correct terminology for, between invasive species, which are those that are, as I understand it, those are introduced and can cause harm and do not have the natural predators or things to control them. The natural migration of species, which we will see with climate change, as they move into different climatic zones, and then those species that have been introduced historically and then become naturalized here over different time frames, and are now integrated into our ecosystem. I think that it's a very important subject for ecology and thinking about the fragility of some of those places. I'm sure there are ways in which we understand the history of that introduction, but I think I would probably want to defer to an ecologist for that one.
Yep, all the more of working all together.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Hana.